Hey everyone, get ready to dive into a really fascinating period, 20th century China. But hold on, we're not talking politics or wars this time.
No, not this time.
We're going deep into the world of ideas,
That's right.
specifically economic ones,
Yeah.
with Rebecca E. Carl's book, The Magic of Concepts.
And you might be thinking, economic theories. Sounds dry. But trust me, Carl makes it anything but boring.
Okay, how so?
What she does so brilliantly is show how these ideas,
Uh-huh.
especially about pre-capitalist societies,
Okay.
have basically acted like invisible forces shaping how we view China's past and even its present.
Okay, invisible forces. I'm intrigued. It's like we're talking about economic ghost stories.
It kind of is, in a way.
So tell me more about this conceptual magic. What is Carl actually getting at?
It's this idea that some concepts, even those that sound super objective and academic, can be like illusions.
Okay.
They subtly influence our perceptions of history without us even realizing it. Think of it like a magician's trick. We're so focused on the spectacle that we miss the sleight of hand happening behind the scenes.
So these concepts are kind of like intellectual smoke and mirrors, distorting our view.
Exactly. And Carl argues this happened in a huge way when people tried to understand China's economic development.
Interesting.
One example she gives is fascinating because it involves comparing China to Japan.
The classic East Asia comparison. Everyone wants to know why Japan rocketed ahead in the 19th century while China seemed to lag behind.
Exactly. And it's in those comparisons that the magic really starts to reveal itself. The very questions we ask why one succeeded, why the other struggled, they're already framed by certain concepts we might not even be aware of.
It's like those concepts are the starting line of the race, already influencing the outcome before we even begin. So how does this all play out with China specifically? Give me an example of one of these magical concepts that Carl tackles.
Well, get ready for some jargon, but I promise we'll unpack it.
There.
The Asiatic mode of production, or AMP. Don't worry, it's not as intimidating as it sounds.
Okay, AMP it is. Break it down for me. What's the gist of this theory, and why was it so important in the context of China?
Essentially, the AMP try to explain why China and other Asian societies seem to develop differently than Europe. It argued that these societies had unique characteristics that made them somehow less suited to capitalism.
So it's trying to create a model for understanding different paths of economic development. But I'm guessing there were some problems with this theory.
You bet. Scholars have been debating this for decades. One major critique is that the AMP relies too heavily on generalizations about entire regions and cultures.
Yeah, I can see how that could be problematic.
It risks creating stereotypes rather than accurately reflecting the complexities of these societies.
It's like trying to squeeze a square peg into a round hole. You can't force a one-size-fits-all explanation onto something as diverse and dynamic as a whole region's history.
Exactly. And that's something Carl warns us about. These grand theories can be tempting, but we have to be so careful not to fall into the trap of oversimplification.
It's like they're all the same arguments, totally ignoring the nuances and individual stories that make each culture and society unique.
Right. And the AMP, despite its flaws, is a perfect example of what Carl calls a zombie idea.
A zombie idea. Okay, now you have to explain that one. What does it mean for an idea to be a zombie?
It means that even though it might be discredited or outdated, it just won't die. It keeps coming back in different forms, haunting our discussions and influencing how we think. The AMP, even with its flaws, still pops up in modern debates about China's economy.
So it's less about the theory being right or wrong and more about its staying power, its ability to linger in the back of our minds and shape our thinking, even today.
Exactly. And that's why understanding these zombie ideas is so important. They can help us see how certain narratives about China, or any country for that matter, have developed, and how they might still be influencing our understanding of current events.
It's like we're unraveling the hidden DNA of these ideas, tracing their lineage through history to see how they've mutated and evolved over time. Okay, so we've got these zombie ideas like the AMP, but Carl also talks about this almost mystical allure of the market. What's that about?
It's fascinating how the market is often presented as this magical solution for economic growth and prosperity. But Carl pushes back against that simplistic view, especially when it comes to China. She argues that we need to look deeper.
So it's not as simple as saying free markets equal automatic success.
Not at all.
Mm.
Carl encourages us to question this idea of the market itself. How has it been used, and often misused, to explain China's economic past and even its present?
So it's like the market itself becomes one of those magical concepts, subtly shaping how we view China's economic journey.
Exactly. And to illustrate this, Karl delves into the influence of the Austrian School of Economics, which has a very particular take on markets and value.
Okay, so who are these Austrian economists and why are they relevant to our understanding of China?
The Austrian school, they're like the philosophers of individual desire in economics. They believe that value is subjective, determined by how much individuals want or need something.
Interesting. So it's not just about the cold, hard facts of supply and demand, but also about individual perceptions and desires.
Exactly. And this focus on individual desire and what they call use value, it's particularly interesting when we think about China's development into this massive consumer-driven economy.
It makes you wonder if there are echoes of these Austrian school ideas in China's more recent economic policies, even if they're not explicitly stated.
That's a brilliant observation, and it's something we'll unpack further in our next segment.
So we've been talking about these big economic ideas, but Carl doesn't just leave us hanging with abstract theories.
No, not at all.
She dives into specific historical contexts.
She does.
And one of the most compelling is China's experience in the 20th century.
Yeah, and this is where it gets really interesting because China in the 20th century doesn't fit neatly into the box of a traditional colony,
Right.
nor was it fully independent.
Okay, so not a colony, but not exactly calling the shots either. What was going on there?
Carl uses this really insightful term, semi-colonialism, to describe China's situation.
Okay.
And it captures this complex web of relationships with foreign powers and the internal struggles for power and development that were happening simultaneously.
So semi-colonialism is like this lens that helps us understand those tangled dynamics, both internal and external, that were shaping China's path.
Exactly. It acknowledges the unequal power dynamics at play between China and these global forces
Uh-huh.
and shows how those dynamics impacted its economic development and its place in the world.
It's like trying to walk a tightrope while juggling. You've got to maintain your balance while dealing with all these external forces pulling you in different directions.
That's a great analogy. And one of the things Carl does so well is to illustrate these complex ideas through specific examples.
Okay, like what?
She dives into a fascinating analysis of two films set in Shanghai that really bring this concept of semi-colonialism to life.
Okay, so we're talking movies now. Tell me more about these films and what they reveal about Shanghai and these bigger economic ideas.
The first film is called Crows and Sparrows, made right on the cusp of the Communist Revolution in 1948 and 49.
Okay.
It paints a picture of Shanghai that's very different from the glamorous cosmopolitan image we often have.
Oh, interesting. So not the glitz and glam. What does this film show us about Shanghai?
It shows us a city grappling with intense social and political upheaval.
Okay.
It's a Shanghai of everyday people struggling to survive amidst economic hardship, political uncertainty, and the threat of war.
It's interesting how this film captures that sense of being caught between eras, the old world crumbling, the new world not yet formed.
Right.
Very much in line with that idea of semi-colonialism we were just talking about.
Exactly. And this portrayal contrasts sharply with the second film Carl analyzes, Once Upon a Time in Shanghai, made in the 1990s, decades later.
Okay.
This film presents a very different vision of Shanghai.
Okay, so what's the vibe of Shanghai in this later film? Did things change that dramatically?
Dramatically is an understatement. Once Upon a Time in Shanghai drips with nostalgia.
Really?
It presents a romanticized view of the city as a place of economic vibrancy, cosmopolitan flair, and a longing for a bygone era.
It's like those sepia-toned photos that make the past seem so much more glamorous than it probably was. But how does this nostalgic portrayal of Shanghai connect back to the magic concepts Carl is talking about?
This is where it gets really insightful.
Okay.
Carl argues that by presenting this nostalgic vision of a glamorous, prosperous Shanghai, the film subtly reinforces certain economic ideas.
So it's like the film itself becomes a vehicle for promoting a particular economic narrative.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the narrative it promotes, with its emphasis on a return to prosperity and openness, aligns with those ideas about the allure of the market and economic liberalization that we were discussing earlier.
It's amazing how these films, even though they're set in different periods, both reflect these larger ideological currents swirling around China's economic identity.
Yeah.
But it makes you wonder, are these just stories being told on screen, or do they have a real impact on how people understand China?
That's a crucial question,
Mhm.
and one that Carl wants us to think about. How do these cultural products, like films, shape our perceptions of history, economics, and even entire nations?
It's like those films become little windows into these larger debates about China's past, present, and future.
They do.
And it's not always clear where reality ends and the magic of these concepts begins.
Exactly.
Mm.
And that ambiguity, that blurring of lines, is precisely what makes Carl's analysis so compelling.
So we've gone from these grand economic theories to specific examples like those Shanghai films.
Yeah.
It's amazing how Carl weaves it all together, showing how these seemingly abstract ideas actually play out in the real world.
It really is.
And that's what makes her work so valuable.
Hmm.
She's not just talking about economics in a vacuum. She's showing how these concepts have shaped our understanding of history,
Right.
culture, and even the way we view China's place in the world today. It's like she's giving us a new pair of glasses to see these hidden connections between economic thought and the stories we tell ourselves about China.
That's a great way to put it.
It makes you wonder, has China been able to break free from the magic of these older concepts? Or are they still influencing how we perceive its economic rise?
Ah, the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
It's easy to assume that as China modernizes and becomes this global economic powerhouse, it would somehow shed those older,
Right.
perhaps less flattering ways of thinking about its economy.
Right, like we expect this clean break with the past,
Yeah,
out with the old, in with the new.
exactly. But as Carl so brilliantly points out, it's rarely that simple.
Okay.
These zombie ideas, as she calls them, have a way of sticking around. They might morph into new forms or linger in the background, subtly shaping our perceptions, even when we think we've moved on.
So it's like they're hiding in plain sight, influencing our understanding of China's economic moves even today.
Yeah.
That's a little unnerving. Can you give me an example of how this might play out in our current world?
Think about the ongoing debates about China's economic model.
Okay.
Some argue it's a form of state capitalism. Others call it market authoritarianism.
Right.
These labels, even with their nuances, often still carry echoes of those older concepts we've been discussing.
So even when we're trying to define China's present-day economic system, we're still partly trapped by those historical narratives and magical concepts.
Exactly. And that's not to say these labels are entirely wrong or useless. But it's crucial to be aware of the baggage they carry, the historical debates they evoke. Are we seeing China's actions through a clear lens, or are we imposing outdated frameworks that might not fit the reality?
It's a good reminder to always question our assumptions, especially when dealing with something as complex and rapidly changing as China's economy.
It is.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the magic of concepts, what's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with?
I hope they'll come away with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Okay.
Not cynicism, but a critical eye.
Okay.
When you hear those grand narratives about China's economic rise or fall, remember Carl's insights.
Okay.
Look for the magic at play. Those subtle biases, those historical echoes, those taken-for-granted assumptions that might be shaping the story.
It's like we've been given a secret decoder ring to decipher the hidden messages embedded in our economic language.
Yeah.
I love it. This deep dive has definitely given me a lot to think about.
It's a fascinating topic.
Huge thanks to Rebecca E. Carl for providing us with these invaluable tools to navigate the complexities of China's economic story.
Absolutely. Her work is a must-read for anyone who wants to understand not just China's economic past, but how those historical currents continue to ripple through our present-day discussions and debates.
And to our listeners, we'll leave you with this. The next time you read a headline about China's economy, take a moment to pause and ask yourself, am I seeing this clearly, or am I under the influence of conceptual magic? Until next time, keep exploring.